$65 billion. That's how much Bernie Madoff stole. Not from banks, not from governments, from people, retirees, Holocaust survivors, charities, his closest friends, his own family. And when it all collapsed, people didn't just lose money. They lost their lives. Literally. At least 3 of his victims committed suicide. His eldest son hanged himself in his apartment on the 2nd anniversary of his father's arrest, while his 2-year-old son slept in the next room. His other son died of lymphoma 2 years later, a disease his family says was triggered by the stress of learning his father was a monster. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the one agency whose entire job was to catch people like Madoff, investigated him 5 separate times over 16 years. 5 times. They found nothing. Not because the fraud was sophisticated, because nobody wanted to look. This is the full story. Every lie. Every victim. Every person who looked the other way. And the answer to a question almost nobody asks: how did one man fool the entire financial world for nearly half a century? If that question interests you, do me a favor, hit subscribe right now. Because this channel goes deeper than anyone else on stories like this. And what you're about to hear will change how you see money, trust, and power forever. Let's start with who Bernie Madoff actually was. Not the mugshot. Not the courtroom footage. The man before the fall. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born on April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York. His parents, Ralph and Sylvia, both ran small financial businesses from home. Both were registered with the SEC. Both were shut down by regulators. That detail matters. Before Bernie Madoff ever stole a single dollar, he watched his own parents navigate the gray areas of finance. He learned something early. The system is built on trust. And trust can be manufactured. In 1960, at age 22, Madoff started his own firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. He launched it with $5,000 he'd saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. $5,000. That's what the seed of a $65 billion fraud looked like. A kid from Queens with a small office and a big idea. And here's what most people get wrong about Madoff. They think he started as a con man. He didn't. His legitimate business was real. And it was genuinely successful. Madoff became a pioneer in electronic trading. He was instrumental in building the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. He served as its chairman 3 times. He was respected. He was trusted. He sat on SEC advisory committees, literally advising the people who were supposed to regulate him. That's not just the fox guarding the henhouse. That's the fox designing the henhouse. So when did the fraud begin? Nobody knows for certain. Madoff himself gave conflicting answers. In one version, he said it started in the early 1990s. In another, he admitted it may have begun as far back as the 1970s. Prosecutors believe the truth is closer to the 1970s. That means Madoff ran his Ponzi scheme for roughly 40 years. 40 years of taking money from new investors and using it to pay old investors. No actual investments were ever made. None. 0. Every single account statement his clients received was fiction. Think about that for a second. Thousands of account statements. Decades of fabricated returns, monthly reports showing gains in specific stocks that were never purchased. Trade confirmations for transactions that never happened. All of it. Every page, every number was a lie. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, how could anyone fall for that? That's the wrong question. The right question is, why would anyone suspect it? Madoff's returns weren't outrageous. That was his genius. He didn't promise 30 or 40% annual returns. He promised steady, consistent gains, usually between 10 and 12% year after year, regardless of market conditions. In a bull market, he made 12%. In a crash, he made 10%. No losses. Ever. And that should have been the red flag. Because in finance, consistent returns with no losses don't exist. They can't. Markets fluctuate. Even the best investors have losing quarters. Warren Buffett has losing years. But Madoff? Never. His performance was too perfect. And that perfection was the one thing that should have destroyed him decades before it did. A man named Harry Markopolos figured this out in 1999. He was a financial analyst in Boston. His boss asked him to reverse engineer Madoff's strategy, to figure out how Madoff was generating those returns so they could replicate them. Markopoulos spent 4 hours analyzing Madoff's reported trades. 4 hours. That's all it took. He concluded it was mathematically impossible. The returns couldn't be real. The strategy Madoff claimed to use couldn't produce those results. Markopoulos didn't suspect fraud. He was certain of it. He went to the SEC. He filed a detailed complaint. He laid out the math. He showed the impossibility. He named Madoff directly. The SEC did nothing. Not a delayed investigation. Not a half-hearted inquiry. Nothing. If that makes you angry, subscribe to this channel because we cover stories where the system fails, and understanding those failures is the first step to holding people accountable. Hit subscribe. You won't regret it. Markopoulos went back to the SEC in 2000, again in 2001, again in 2005, again in 2007. He submitted a 21-page document titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." 21 pages of evidence. Mathematical proof. Named witnesses. Specific. Actionable intelligence. The SEC received this document, assigned an investigator, and that investigator later admitted he didn't understand the math. He didn't ask for help. He didn't consult an expert. He closed the case. 5 complaints. 16 years. 0 action. Meanwhile, Madoff's client list was growing. And this is where the story gets personal. Where the numbers become people. Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Holocaust survivor, author of Night, one of the most important books ever written about human suffering. His foundation, the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, invested virtually all its assets with Madoff. $15.2 million. Gone. The foundation was forced to close. A man who survived Auschwitz had his life's work destroyed by a man he trusted. If you're still here, you already know this channel delivers. But thousands of people are watching without subscribing. If you're one of them, take 2 seconds. Hit the button. It helps this channel keep making videos exactly like this one. And it costs you nothing. Steven Spielberg. Jeffrey Katzenberg. Kevin Bacon. Hall of Fame pitcher Sandy Koufax. The Wilpon family, owners of the New York Mets. Senator Frank Lautenberg. Madoff's client list read like a who's who of American wealth and celebrity. But it wasn't just the wealthy who were destroyed. Thousands of ordinary people, retirees, teachers, small business owners, had invested their life savings through Madoff's feeder funds. These were funds managed by other firms that quietly funneled money to Madoff, taking a cut while asking no questions. One victim was Burt Ross, the former mayor of Fort Lee, New Jersey. He lost $5 million. His entire retirement. He'd invested with Madoff on the recommendation of a friend. He later described the moment he learned the truth as the worst moment of his life. Worse, he said, than the murder of his first wife and daughter in 1983. He'd survived that unimaginable tragedy and rebuilt his life, only to have Madoff take everything he'd rebuilt. Another victim, a 65-year-old retired British soldier named William Foxton, lost all his savings. He drove to a park in Southampton, England, and shot himself. He left a note apologizing to his family for leaving them with nothing. Thierry Magon de la Vie-Houchet ran a feeder fund that had sent over $1 billion to Madoff. When the fraud was exposed, he locked himself in his office on Madison Avenue and slit his wrists. He bled to death at his desk. He was 65 years old. These weren't abstract losses. These were destroyed lives. And every single one was preventable. So what finally brought Madoff down? Not the SEC, not an investigation, not a whistleblower's triumph. Madoff brought himself down. Because that's how Ponzi schemes end. They always end. The math guarantees it. In the fall of 2008, the global financial crisis hit. Markets crashed. Investors panicked. And panicked investors do one thing. They pull their money out. In November 2008, Madoff received $7 billion in redemption requests. $7 billion from clients who wanted their money back. But the money didn't exist. It had never existed. The accounts were empty. The returns were fictional. There was nothing to withdraw. On December 10, 2008, Madoff called his 2 sons, Mark and Andrew, into his apartment. He told them everything. The firm's investment advisory business, the one he'd run for decades, was, in his words, one big lie. He said it was, basically, a giant Ponzi scheme. He estimated the losses at $50 billion. The final number would be $65 billion. Mark and Andrew Madoff did something their father never expected. They called a lawyer. The lawyer called the FBI. The next morning, December 11, 2008, 2 FBI agents knocked on Madoff's door. They asked if there was an innocent explanation for what his sons had reported. Madoff said no. There is no innocent explanation, he told them. He was arrested in his bathrobe. But here's the part most documentaries skip. What happened to the family? Mark Madoff, Bernie's eldest son, was never charged with any crime. The investigation found no evidence he knew about the fraud. But it didn't matter. The Madoff name was poison. He received death threats. His marriage crumbled. His children were harassed. He couldn't walk down the street without being recognized. On December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest, Mark Madoff hanged himself with a dog leash from a ceiling pipe in his Soho apartment. His 2-year-old son, Nick, was asleep in the next room. He was 46 years old. Leave a comment below. Tell me, do you think Mark Madoff was a victim or an accomplice? I want to hear what you think. Because the answer isn't as simple as it seems. Andrew Madoff was also never charged. He cooperated fully with investigators. But in 2014, he died of mantle cell lymphoma at age 48. His family blamed the stress of the scandal for accelerating his cancer. Whether that's medically provable doesn't change the fact that both of Bernie Madoff's sons were dead within 6 years of his arrest. Ruth Madoff, Bernie's wife of 50 years, attempted suicide. She and Bernie swallowed pills together on Christmas Eve 2008, 2 weeks after his arrest. They both survived. She later said it was a pact. They'd agreed to die together. She lost her home, her fortune, and both her children. She's still alive. She lives in a small apartment in Connecticut. She reportedly subsists on Social Security and a $2.5 million settlement, a fraction of 1% of what her husband stole. And Madoff himself? He pleaded guilty on March 12, 2009. He was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison, the maximum possible. The judge, Denny Chin, said Madoff's crimes were extraordinarily evil. Madoff showed no emotion during sentencing. He never cooperated meaningfully with investigators to help recover funds. He never provided a full accounting of where the money went. He never named accomplices. He died in prison on April 14, 2021. He was 82 years old. He died of chronic kidney disease in a federal medical center in Butte, North Carolina. He died in a prison cell. He died alone. Now, if you think this was just one man's crime, you're wrong. And this is where the story gets even darker. Madoff had help. Not just from his inner circle, though 5 of his employees were convicted of conspiracy, fraud, and forgery. Frank DePascali, his chief financial officer, confessed to helping fabricate thousands of account statements. He knew there were no trades. He created them anyway. Annette Bongiorno, his secretary, generated fake trade records for over 40 years. She literally typed fictional transactions into a computer, day after day, for 4 decades. But the deeper failure was institutional. J.P. Morgan Chase was Madoff's primary bank for over 20 years. They held his accounts. They processed his transactions. Internal bank documents later revealed that J.P. Morgan employees suspected fraud as early as 2006. One internal email called Madoff's returns too good to be true. Another flagged suspicious transaction patterns. The bank filed a suspicious activity report with British authorities, but not with U.S. regulators. They kept his accounts. They kept collecting fees. In 2014, J.P. Morgan paid $2.6 billion in penalties and settlements related to their failure to flag Madoff's fraud. $2.6 billion. That's how much it cost them for looking the other way. It sounds like a lot. It was less than 1/4's profit for the bank. Share this video with someone who thinks the financial system protects ordinary people. Because it doesn't. It protects itself. And stories like this prove it. The SEC's failure was even more damning. An internal investigation by the SEC's own Inspector General, David Kotz, found that the agency had received 6 substantive complaints about Madoff, dating back to 1992. 6 complaints. 16 years. Multiple examiners and investigators had direct contact with Madoff. Some were impressed by his status. Some were intimidated by his reputation. Some simply didn't understand the math. One SEC attorney, Eric Swanson, was actually dating Madoff's niece during one of the investigations. He later married her. He was never disciplined. The Cots report concluded that the SEC had the information, the authority, and the opportunity to uncover Madoff's fraud as early as 1992. They failed because of incompetence, inexperience, and institutional deference to a man who seemed too important to question. Harry Markopoulos, the analyst who'd spent 9 years trying to expose Madoff, testified before Congress in 2009. He told lawmakers that the SEC was over-lawyered and undersmart. He described his years of frustration, the ignored complaints, the unanswered letters. He said he'd feared for his life during his investigation, believing Madoff might have connections to organized crime. Whether that fear was justified is debatable. What's not debatable is that one man with a calculator figured out in 4 hours what the most powerful financial regulator in the world couldn't figure out in 16 years. And now I need to tell you the most disturbing part. Irving Picard was appointed as the bankruptcy trustee to recover funds for Madoff's victims. As of 2024, he has recovered approximately $14.7 billion of the estimated $17.5 billion in principal losses. That's an extraordinary recovery rate. Roughly 84% of the actual money invested has been clawed back through lawsuits, settlements, and asset seizures. But here's the catch. The $65 billion number? That included the fictional profits Madoff reported, the money that never existed. So victims who invested $1 million and saw their statements show $3 million were told, your real loss was $1 million. The $2 million you thought you had? It was never real. You can't lose what you never had. Try explaining that to a 70-year-old retiree who made life decisions based on those statements, who bought a house, paid for grandchildren's college, donated to charity, all based on money that existed only on paper. The statements were fiction. The consequences were real. If this video is teaching you something you didn't know before, hit subscribe. I mean it. This is the kind of content that takes weeks to research. And if you subscribe, the algorithm shows you more of it. That's how this works. 2 seconds. Subscribe button. Let's keep going. So what did we learn? What changed because of Bernie Madoff? The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 reformed financial regulation in the United States. The SEC increased its examination staff. New rules required investment advisors to undergo surprise audits. The SEC created a specialized unit for investigating Ponzi schemes. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Tips are now taken more seriously, at least in theory. But here's the contrarian truth that nobody wants to hear. Ponzi schemes haven't stopped. Not even close. Since Madoff's arrest, the SEC has charged more than 500 Ponzi schemes. 500. Alan Stanford stole $7 billion. Tom Petter stole $3.7 billion. Scott Rothstein stole $1.2 billion. These are just the ones that were caught. The system didn't learn. The system adjusted. There's a difference. Learning means the problem doesn't repeat. Adjusting means the problem repeats differently. Subscribe if you want to know about those cases. Because we're covering Stanford next, and his story is arguably worse than Madoff's, because he operated from a private island and bribed government officials for a decade. Now let me tell you where the survivors are. Because this story doesn't end with a prison sentence. Irving Picard has sent recovery checks to thousands of victims. Some received full recovery of their principal. Others received partial payments. The process took over 15 years and is still ongoing. Some victims died before receiving a single dollar back. Elie Wiesel's foundation never recovered. It closed permanently. The legacy of one of humanity's most important moral voices was financially erased by a man from Queens who wanted more. Bert Ross, the former mayor who lost everything, wrote a book about his experience. He became an advocate for Ponzi scheme victims. He rebuilt his life again. For the 3rd time, Ruth Madoff lives in anonymity. She reportedly has no relationship with her grandchildren from Mark's marriage. She has said publicly that she wishes she and Bernie had succeeded in their suicide attempt. The Wilpon family, who owned the Mets, settled with the Picard trustee for $162 million. They later sold the team, and Madoff himself In prison, he reportedly showed little remorse. In interviews, he expressed frustration that he'd been caught, not guilt that he'd stolen. He told one journalist that his clients were greedy and should have known the returns were too good. He blamed the banks, the SEC, and the market for enabling him. He never took full responsibility. His last known statement of substance was this: "I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders." Not the weight of his victims' suffering, not the weight of his sons' deaths, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Bernie Madoff died believing he was the victim of his own crime. Let me leave you with this. $65 billion is a number so large it loses meaning. So let me make it real. $65 billion could fund every public school in New York City for over 2 years. It could provide clean water to every person on Earth who currently lacks it. It could end homelessness in the United States for a decade. One man stole that amount. Not through violence, not through hacking, through trust, through a handshake, through a smile and a steady return on a piece of paper that meant nothing. The next Ponzi scheme is operating right now. Somewhere, someone is printing fake statements, promising steady returns, and trusting that nobody will check. And somewhere, a Harry Markopolos is checking and being ignored. Madoff didn't break the system. He revealed that the system was already broken. He just used the cracks. Drop a comment. Tell me, what was the most shocking part of this story for you? Was it the SEC failing 5 times? The Suns' deaths? JP Morgan's complicity? I read every comment. And if you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one. The money is gone. The victims are aging. The prison cell is empty. And the system that let it happen? It's still running.